This is everything wrong with American education. When American students are taught about the history of the Pacific Theater during World War II, we are only taught about two things: the bombing of Pearl Harbor, then dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We forget everything else, and it leads to people like this guy, who thinks that the Japanese only targeted military targets, not civilians, but the Americans, so evil and imperialistic, targeted civilians by dropping the bombs. And that's just fundamentally untrue to how the war actually happened. For starters, the list of Japanese war crimes during World War II rivals that of the Germans in Europe, if not worse by some people's accounts. For example, this is often heard and called the Asian Holocaust because of how many victims there were. And yes, it was mainly civilians. Probably the most notorious of which was this one, the Nanjing Massacre, which is more infamously known by another name, which TikTok censors do not like. And it has estimates of 200,000 deaths, not to mention all the other stuff below, which makes it incredibly brutal and evil. And another one, the Manila Massacre, which has estimated deaths at 100,000 to 500,000, most of which, once again, were civilians. And maybe the most sick and disgusting of them all, Unit 731, where medical experiments were done on people that rival any of the horrific things that you've heard of German scientists at the time doing on civilians as well. And it was done because they wanted to see what happened when you gave people diseases. How could they use that for chemical warfare, which they actually planned to use against the United States of America. There was a planned balloon attack where they were going to have bubonic plague, anthrax, rinderpest, and smut fungus sent through balloons to release on the American public. And yeah, this would have been nasty and probably in the long run would have unalived far more people than the two atomic bombs. But furthermore, Imperial Japan had a very, very specific ideology. I've described it as a death cult before, and this ideology completely militarized the entire populace. And those targets in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not civilian targets. They were military targets that were interwoven within the civilians that lived in those cities. Japan was in a state of total war. They mobilized the entire populace for the sake of the war. And because of this, it was believed by most military experts at the time that the Japanese would have fought to the very, very last man. And by all accounts that we have from the Japanese, that was probably true. They probably would have. And if we didn't drop the bombs, the alternatives were most likely a land invasion, continued traditional bombardment, think the firebombings of Tokyo, or a naval blockade which would have starved millions of Japanese people instead. Not to mention, if we had had that invasion, eventually the Soviets might have got involved into the invasion too, so you would have had mainland Japan invaded by both the Americans and the Soviets, and you might have a North and South Korea situation now in Japan. But maybe one of the things I find most interesting about this is how it's labeled a genocide by Americans, and that those civilians were just innocent and it's the Americans' faults. But no one wants to put the blame on the imperial system in Japan, which indoctrinated the Japanese into believing this ideology. The imperial Japanese system is why they were put in this situation to begin with. They are the perpetrators that caused this to begin. The Americans only reacted to it after we were attacked. Then we saw the atrocities that they were doing to the Chinese, Koreans, and other Asians within the region. This idea that the Americans committed genocide is just so fundamentally untrue and doesn't meet any definition of the word. The people committing genocide were Imperial Japan. Some of y'all really need to read a history book.